Vinod made a pizza by combining 360 grams of flour with 210 grams of cheese. So he added these two and made a pizza. He made another pizza in which he added 240 grams of flour with 140 grams of cheese. Now, can you tell me whether the ratio of cheese to flour in both the cases is the same? Let us look at this. Remember, we have to find the ratio of cheese to flour. So let us do that. Let's look at the first case, which is the large pizza, wherein he used 210 grams of cheese and 360 grams of flour. So cheese to flour, order is important, is 210 is to 360. Now this would be, we have to express this in the simplest form. That is, we'll remove the common factors from both of them. I see 10 as a common factor. So this gives me 21 is to 36. Further 3 is a common factor here. So I get 7 is to 12. So ratio of weight of cheese to flour in this large pizza comes out to be 7 is to 12. Now let's look at the second pizza which he had made, which is the smaller one. So in this small pizza, he had used 140 grams of cheese and 240 grams of flour. So ratio of weights of cheese to flour would be 140 is to 240, 140 is to 240. Again, express this in the simplest form. I can see 10 as a common factor in both these terms. So this would be equal to 14 is to 24. Removing the common factors, divide by that factor. Now 14 is to 24. Again, what we can see is a common factor which is 2. So dividing by 2, we get 7 is to 12. So I get that ratio of weights used in cheese to flour in the small pizza is 7 is to 12. So for the large pizza also, the cheese to flour ratio was 7 is to 12. For the small pizza also, the ratio of cheese to flour is 7 is to 12. So we were asked whether the ratio is the same or not. Well, you can clearly see that in both the cases, ratio is the same. So what we can say is that ratio of cheese to flour in both the cases is the same or is equal. And when two ratios are equal, we call them to be in proportion. So, if there are two ratios, say A is to B and C is to D, which are in proportion, that is, if they are equal, they would be in proportion, then I write it as A is to B, we know is equal to C is to D. Now, when two ratios are equal, we say they are in proportion, and the symbol for proportionality is, we use this symbol to denote that they are in proportion. The two ratios are in proportion. That is, these two ratios are equal. We know we read this as A is to B. Similarly, this is read as is as to. That is, A is to B is as to C is to D. So when two ratios are equal, they are in proportion, and if they are in proportion, we can represent it like this, wherein we say A is to B is as to C is to D. So we have this, A is to B is as to C is to D. Now look at these two terms. They are at the extreme ends, so we call these terms as extremes, and these terms which are in the middle are called the means. So the terms outside, which is A and D, are the extremes. B and C, the terms in the middle, are the means. So B and C are means. So if you have this, that is A is to B is as to C is to D, if I am given that two ratios are in proportion, what I know is that A by B is equal to C by D. Because A is to B can be written as A by B. Proportion means the ratios are equal, and C is to D can be written as C by D. Now from here, cross multiplying, I get AD, A times D, AD is equal to C times B, which is BC. So this is what I get. First is A by B would be equal to C by D. Cross multiplying, I get AD equals to BC. How do I get this? I get this by the cross product rule. You can multiply. So this is called the cross product rule, and you get AD equals to BC. So what we see is whenever two ratios are in proportion, you are getting AD which is equal to BC. So this is what you get if you know that two ratios are in proportion. And what is A and D? A and D are nothing but extremes, and B and C are nothing but means. So we can say that the product of extremes is equal to the product of means. This is what we get. Hence remember that whenever two ratios are equal, we say that they are in proportion. And whenever two ratios are in proportion, I can say that product of extremes would be equal to the product of means. This is what you should remember. Now let's look at this. This is a recipe for fruit cream. What we do is we add 200 grams of sugar to 500 grams of cream, and further 500 grams of fruit cream is added to 1250 grams of fruits to prepare that fruit cream. Now I'll represent this diagrammatically, which says 200 grams of sugar is added to 500 grams of cream, and 500 grams of cream is added to 1250 grams of fruits. So this is the recipe for the fruit cream. Now let's find the ratio of sugar to cream and ratio of cream to fruits in both the case. So ratio of sugar to cream would be 200:500. Now again, common factor which is 100. So I can write this as in simplest form as 2:5. I express this in the simplest form. So ratio of sugar to cream comes out to be 2:5. Now let's find the ratio of cream to fruits, which is 500:1250 grams. So 500:1250. Again, 10 is a common factor here. So I get 50:125. Now again 25 is a common factor here. 25 2s are 50 and 25 5s are 125. So I get 2:5 again. What I see is that the two ratios are equal. That is 200:500 is as to 500:1250. So the two ratios are equal. So we get this, that ratio of sugar to cream is also 2:5 and ratio of cream to fruits is also 2:5. That is, these two ratios are equal. So what I can say is that ratio of sugar is to cream is equal to ratio of cream and fruits, that is cream is to fruits. When two ratios are equal, I can say that they are in proportion. So I can say that sugar is to cream is as to cream is to fruits. Now, when two ratios are in proportion, the product of means should be equal to the product of extremes. Let's find that out. Let's find the product of extremes. That is sugar and fruits. They are the extremes. So sugar is 200 grams and fruits is 1250. So this comes out to be this is the product of extremes, 25 followed by 4 zeros. Now let's look at the product of means, which is cream in both cases. This is 500 times 500. So product of means would be 500 times 500, which is 5 5s are 25 and 4 zeros. So we see that the product of means is equal to the product of extremes. So we can say that product of extremes is equal to the product of means. We can see that these ratios are in proportion and the product of extremes is equal to the product of means. Further, if you look at these two ratios carefully, what you will observe is that cream is the same. So what you can say is that sugar is to cream is as to cream is to fruits. Now rather than repeating the cream again and again, that is twice, we can just write it once. So we say that sugar is to cream and cream is to fruits are in proportion. Now we are repeating cream 2 times. So to avoid that, what we can say is that sugar, cream and fruits are in continued proportion. That is sugar, cream and fruits are in continued proportion. So let's look at this. So if we have terms like this, that is A, B, B, C. B is repeated twice. So if you have something like this and they are said to be in proportion, then you would know that if they are in proportion, then the ratios are equal. That is A is to B is as to B is to C. Further, since B is the same in both the cases, what we can say is that A, B, C are in continued proportion. Now when they are in continued proportion, it's still a proportion. Hence the product of extremes would be equal to the product of means. So let's find the product of means and extremes. In this case, product of means would be B times B. And product of extremes would be A and C. So A times C. So this gives me B times B is B square, which is equals to A times C, AC. So this is what I get, that B square is AC. Now I can find B also from here. B would be taking square root, positive square root, we get AC. So B comes out to be under root AC. And this B is actually called the mean proportion between A and C. B is called the mean proportion between A and C. So whenever you're given that 3 quantities are in continued proportion, so if I'm given that 3 quantities are in continued proportion, what I can gather from here is that the middle term has to be repeated twice. That is, A is to B is as to B is to C. So A is to B is as to B is to C. That is, A, B, C are in continued proportion. Now let's see if you can answer this question. It says that in a company, the number of people shortlisted to the number of people interviewed to the number of people who are selected, that's in a continued proportion. That is, people shortlisted, interviewed and selected finally for the job are in continued proportion. Now the company wishes to select only 4 people. It has a place for 4 people and they have already shortlisted 100 candidates. So how many candidates should they call for interview round? Let's look at this. We know that people shortlisted, interviewed and selected are in continued proportion. Let's represent shortlisted people as A, people interviewed as B and people selected as C. So we know A, B, C are in continued proportion. When A, B, C are in continued proportion, we know that the product of means, which is B square, would be equal to product of extremes, which is AC. B square would be equal to AC. If A, B, C are in continued proportion, we know A is to B is as to B is to C. So from here you can see B square would be equal to AC. Product of means equals to product of extremes. So we get B square is equal to AC. Which implies, now let's find. I want to find B, people who are being interviewed, who have to be called for interview. So B square would be A times C, that is shortlisted into selected. People shortlisted. There were 100 people who were shortlisted. And the company knows that the company has to select only 4 people. So people selected would be 4. So B square is 100 times 4. This is what B square is. Now I can find, so B square turns out to be 400. B would be taking square root, which is 20. I'm ignoring the negative square root because B is number of people who are being interviewed. Now number of people cannot be negative. So B turns out to be 20. That is, for those 4 vacancies that they have, to select 4 people, they had shortlisted 100 and they should call only 20 people for interview round, since people shortlisted, interviewed and selected are in continued proportion. So remember, when A, B, C are in continued proportion, then B square would always be equal to AC. Product of means is equal to product of extremes.